August 1941. US President FDR and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sign the Atlantic Charter. And this includes an agreement to establish a new global organization to help manage international affairs. The organization is named United Nations, originally to denote the countries allied against Germany, Italy, and Japan during World War II. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about the new world order that came into being post World War II. Post World War I, in 1919, the League of Nations was established under the Treaty of Versailles to promote international cooperation and to achieve peace and security across the globe. The League never became the universal organization that had been envisaged, partly because it failed to secure and retain the membership of certain major powers whose participation was very essential to make it effective. And despite President Woodrow Wilson's advocacy, the United States actually did not join the League of Nations, and the USSR joined only in 1934. And the three aggressor states, Germany, Italy, and Japan, withdrew from the League during the 1930s to pursue their expansionist aims. Now, the interesting thing was that the League of Nations was established post World War I. However, during the course of World War II, the Allied powers started talking about what the post-World War II world order would look like. And the Moscow Declaration of 1943 recognized the need for a post-war international organization to succeed the League of Nations. But the first major step towards the formation of the United Nations was taken between August and October of 1944 at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in DC, which was attended by the diplomatic experts of the United States, USSR, and UK, plus China. And the four countries agreed on the general purpose, structure, and function of the new world organization. At the Yalta Conference of February 1945, which was attended by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, additional provisions defining the structure of the United Nations were laid. So between the Dumbarton Oaks proposals and the modifications from the Yalta Conference, followed by the United Nations Conference on International Organization, which was held in San Francisco in April of 1945, that produced the final charter of the United Nations. The San Francisco Conference was attended by representatives of 50 countries from all across the globe. That included 9 from Europe, 21 from the Americas, 7 from the Middle East, 2 from East Asia, and 3 from Africa. The UN Charter was unanimously adopted and signed on June 26 and promulgated on October 24, 1945, which is observed as the UN Day. Though the United Nations was set with the goal of maintaining international peace, and international peace did exist through the post-World War II era, but that existence is primarily credited to the balance of power between the two nuclear superpowers, the United States and the USSR. The fact that the Cold War didn't turn into a hot one was primarily because both superpowers were aware of the disastrous consequences to each other if they indulged in one. But there were victories. Even though it was difficult to gain consensus in the UN Security Council because of the veto power of the permanent members, yet there were times when the UN was able to push for ceasefire in certain conflict areas of the world, notably the Middle East. However, the biggest achievement of the United Nations actually was the decolonization period, wherein it pushed hard to welcome new member states independently into the United Nations fold. And this was made possible by an agreement reached in 1955 on universal membership, which effectively protected countries from seeing their applications vetoed on ideological grounds by either of the superpowers. And as a result, by the 1970s, a great majority of the world's populations were represented in the United Nations by independent governments. But outside of the immediate domain of peace and security, the United Nations has had some significant achievements. And these include the adoption of Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, then the International Covenants of 1966, which included covenants on economic, social, and cultural rights, and the creation of certain funds and programs that were specialized in various kinds of humanitarian activity, like UNICEF, UNESCO, United Nations Development Program, the High Commissioner for Refugees, and most importantly, the World Food Program. Between the late 1980s and the earlier 21st century, the UN Security Council actually, on the maintenance of peace and security across the globe, authorized close to 36 peacekeeping operations, including those in the Balkans, Angola, Haiti, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Somalia. And this finally led to the UN peacekeeping forces getting awarded the 1988 Nobel Prize for Peace. Over a period of time, though, the efficacy of the UN Security Council has been questioned, mainly because of the bickerings and partisanship amongst the 5 permanent members. Now, the 5 permanent members were chosen based on the countries that came out powerful post World War II. But the voting pattern through the course of the years has strictly followed the communist bloc of USSR and now Russia and China versus the Western world, which is US, UK, and France. Several countries like Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan have pushed for permanent membership of the UN Security Council based on the population representation, economic impact, and overall contribution to world trade. This proposal, if accepted, would it end the biased voting that exists today? Well, only time will tell. During the course of the World War II, the Soviet troops had moved from Soviet Russia towards Germany to liberate various countries on the way. And after World War II, they ended up installing pro-Soviet governments in many of these countries. Now, in response, the Western allies, including the United States, started to look at ways to prevent further expansion of the communist influence on the European continent, and this ultimately led to the introduction of the Marshall Plan, which was a way to introduce economic independence in most of the countries negatively impacted by World War II. Now, discussions to prevent further expansion of the Soviet communist regime in Western Europe were still going on when 2 important events happened around 1948. The first one was a Soviet Union sponsored coup which overthrew a democratic government in Czechoslovakia and brought that nation under the communist regime. And then a few months later, in June of 1948, the Soviet Union imposed the Berlin blockade, wherein it cut off ground access to Berlin, forcing the US, Britain, and France to airlift supplies to their sectors within Berlin. And with that, the talks towards military defense in Europe went into high gear, and the discussions concluded on April 4, 1949, when the foreign ministers of 12 countries in North America and Western Europe gathered in Washington, D.C. to sign the North Atlantic Treaty, giving rise to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO was primarily a security pact, with Article 5 stating that a military attack against any of the signatories would be considered an attack against all of them. The original signatories to NATO consisted of Belgium, Britain, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United States. NATO became the backbone of the West's military defenses against the USSR and its allies for the next 40 years, with the membership growing larger over the course of the Cold War. Greece and Turkey were admitted in 1952, and the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, in 1955, and Spain in 1982. The outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950 was crucial for NATO because it raised the apparent threat of all communist countries working together, and it forced the alliance to develop concrete military plans. Ironically, in 1954, the Soviet Union suggested that it should join NATO to preserve peace in Europe. I'm not kidding, that actually happened. The NATO members, though, shot it down because they feared that Soviet Union was coming into NATO to weaken the alliance. In May of 1955, West Germany joined NATO, and the primary reason for inclusion of Germany was that without German manpower, it wouldn't have been possible to field enough conventional forces to resist a Soviet invasion in Europe. And this ended up being a turning point because now the Soviets became more nervous and had to come up with a counter solution. And within less than a week, on May 14, 1955, the Soviets came with their counter solution, the creation of the Warsaw Pact. The original signatories to the Warsaw Pact included Soviet Union, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and East Germany. Like NATO, the Warsaw Pact focused on the objective of creating a coordinated defense amongst its member nations in order to deter any enemy attack. There was also an internal security element to the agreement that proved very useful to the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact provided a mechanism to the Soviets to exercise tighter control over other communist states in Eastern Europe and thereby deter the members from seeking greater autonomy. And this is quite evident from the aggression the Soviet Union indulged in 1956 to quash the revolt in Hungary when it decided to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. I have this episode covered in episode 7 of our series. And it did something similar in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And both times, the logic given was that the action was carried out by the Warsaw Pact rather than the Soviet Union alone. So while the Warsaw Pact was established to counterbalance the power of NATO, there was no direct confrontation between the NATO countries and the Warsaw Pact countries. Instead, most of the conflict was fought on ideological basis, and both NATO and Warsaw Pact led to the expansion of military forces and their integration into the respective blocs. About a month before the signing of the Warsaw Pact, in Bandung, Indonesia, a meeting was held of Asian and African states. And this was organized by Indonesia, Burma, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan. About 29 countries, representing more than half the world's population at the time, sent their delegates. And the core gripe they had at the time was the reluctance by the Western powers to consult them on decisions affecting them. So mainly they were concerned about the tensions that existed in the UN between the People's Republic of China and the United States, and this seemed to come in the way of these countries being able to establish normal relations with the People's Republic of China. They also had concerns about colonialism in certain parts of the world, especially the French influence in North Africa. And they also wanted to censure the aggressive policies followed by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, along with Western colonialism. A 10-point declaration on the promotion of world peace and cooperation was adopted unanimously, and this included the principles of the United Nations Charter and the Panchsheel, which was the 5 principles of mutual respect formulated by India's Jawaharlal Nehru, which included mutual respect for other nations, territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. So essentially, their push was the newly independent countries needed to be allowed to operate and function without external interference and be accorded the same degree of respect as the UN permanent members as well as other powers across the globe. And subsequent to the Bandung Conference emerged the concept of non-alignment, which meant that this group of countries that had recently gained their independence needed to abstain from the use of arrangements of collective defense to serve the particular interests of any of the big powers. So their take was, in the context of the Cold War, countries of the developing world should abstain from allying with any of the 2 superpowers, the United States or the USSR, and should instead join together in support of national self-determination and against all forms of colonialism and imperialism. So essentially they were trying to send the message that, hey, we don't need to be part of NATO or Warsaw Pact and would like you guys, meaning the United States and the USSR, to respect our sovereignty and let us build our own alliances as we deem fit. So the non-aligned movement was founded and held its first conference, which was the Belgrade Conference in 1961, under the collective leadership of Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Sukarno of Indonesia. Incidentally, Joseph Tito, who we'll cover in a subsequent episode, was one person who had stood up to the Soviet Union and defied Soviet efforts to gain control over Yugoslavia. And one of the primary conditions for the membership of the non-aligned movement was that the members could not be part of a multilateral military alliance like the NATO or Warsaw Pact. The primary aim was to give a voice to the developing countries and to encourage their concerted action in world affairs. So they were planning to be neutral to alignments with respect to the world powers, but not neutral with respect to participation in world affairs. So from a political perspective, the new world order that emerged post-World War II had the Western powers on one side, the communist regimes led by the Soviet Union on the other, and a loose cooperation of the newly independent countries to build a collective voice on the global stage. And it is here that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which country has hosted the most refugees? Looking at the data from 2020, about 67% of the refugees come from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And Turkey hosts about half of the Syrian refugees, along with hosting more total refugees than any other country, with an estimated 3.6 million refugees living in Turkey as of mid-2020. So the answer is D, Turkey. Question for the current episode. NATO's Article 5 states that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and it calls for necessary action, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. So the question is, when was Article 5 invoked for the first time? Was it A, 2001 after the 9/11 attacks, B, 1991 after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, C, 1950 at the time of the Korean War, or D, 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Once again, when did NATO invoke Article 5 for the first time? A, 2001 after the 9/11 attacks, B, 1991 after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, C, 1950 at the time of the Korean War, or D, 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have for today's episode. In the next episode, we look at the New World Order, but from a financial and economic perspective. How the gold standard was retired in favor of the new monetary system. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.